Exercise is generally regarded as good for your health, and that's because generally it is. It helps improve cardiovascular function, maintain a healthy weight, improve bone density. The list goes on. Everything your mom, your doctor, and your gym teacher already told you 1,000 times before. But then we get to the extreme levels of physical activity that endurance athletes often do. For example, have you ever been watching something like the Tour de France and thought to yourself, racing all out nearly every day for 3 weeks? There is no way that can be healthy. Surely these riders are taking years off their life by doing this. And whatever unfathomable training they had to do to get that fit in the first place, that can't be healthy for you either. Dude, that is actually a great point. You know, I was signed up for it this year, but now that you said that, I think I'm just going to watch it from the couch with a bag of chips and a beer. You know, just to be on the safe side. That is exactly what we're tackling today. Is there a point at which exercise, specifically endurance exercise, actually becomes unhealthy? And if there is, are you at that point? And at the end of the video, I will be touching on the recent trend of consuming ungodly high amounts of processed carbohydrates to improve your performance. Sure, it may make you faster, but is it actually good for you? Welcome back to the channel. This video is fueled by the feed. As with most things in life, oftentimes too much of a good thing can become a bad thing. You know, like with eating food or going to the gym or watching YouTube videos. Well, except mine, of course. You can never watch too many Dylan Johnson videos. Okay, dude. I haven't even gotten through the intro yet and I already want to click on something else. But is that the case for riding your bike, at least from a health perspective? Let's start with the largest study on physical activity and mortality, which looked at over 660,000 people. If we take a look at this graph, we can see that as the amount of exercise per week increases, the mortality risk goes down, as we would expect. But then, what's that there on the end? That's right, it looks like at a certain point of physical activity, the mortality risk starts going up again, which is exactly what we're worried about. Now, to be fair, the error bars are very wide here because so few people exercise this much per week, so much so that the study could not conclude any excess risk for this highest category group. Okay, well, that's not too concerning until you realize that this highest category group is doing probably the equivalent of 5 to 10 hours per week, depending on how hard you're riding. For a lot of us, that's a pretty standard training week, but many cyclists far exceed this on a weekly basis. And if the trend of this graph continues, one could only imagine which direction it might go. Hint, it's not a good direction. Other similar studies on the topic generally find the same thing. There tends to be a massive decrease in mortality risk as weekly exercise increases at first, and then it levels off, and those exercising the most don't tend to be worse or better off than those who meet the minimum effective dose. This meta-analysis on the topic agrees, and while the graph for all-cause mortality seems to be going back up, suggesting an increase in mortality at higher exercise volumes, notice again that the confidence intervals widen as well, meaning that this can't actually be concluded. And for what it's worth, when you look at death from cardiovascular disease specifically, it appears that more actually is better all the way to the extremes. While these studies do look at large data sets, I think that their biggest limitation is that they're not looking at physical activity the way that we generally do. In fact, the last study that I referenced puts bicycling in the general category of vigorous physical activity, not saying anything about whether or not that bicycling was done at zone 1 or zone 6. The authors of that study are probably facepalming right now because I completely missed the point of their study, but the point that I'm getting at is that these studies are looking at the general population and an amount and intensity of physical activity that the general population would deem reasonable. Endurance athletes are a different breed though, and it goes beyond just our questionable clothing choices. For some reason, we have this sick need to suffer for hours on end and even enjoy it. And a lot of times our physical activity goes well beyond what would be considered reasonable. But do we have any research that could tell us whether or not going to these extremes is damaging for our long-term health? Fortunately, the answer is yes. And where better to look than to Tour de France athletes themselves? This study on the mortality of Tour de France participants compared every French male Tour de France rider from 1947 to 2012 to the general French male population. The good news is that these cyclists experienced a 41% lower mortality than the general population. The Tour is one of the most extreme forms of endurance sports out there, and professional cyclists train more by volume than almost any other endurance sport, with a few notable exceptions. Don't come at me in the comments section, triathletes. So it's good to see that taking endurance sports to the extreme will not put your health at risk more so than the general population. In fact, if anything, you'll be better off than the general population. And this isn't the only study coming to this conclusion. This systematic review on whether or not elite athletes live longer found superior longevity outcomes for elite athletes, particularly those in endurance sports. That being said, I do have to give some pushback on these studies. As easy as it would be to give endurance athletes the win on this one, I think we have to remember who we're up against. Being better off than the general population is not saying a whole lot. That's like the 23-year-old pro showing up to the local group ride and being stoked that he dropped a bunch of middle-aged men with full-time jobs, kids, and beer bellies. Settle down there, guy. Most people are not that healthy, so this is not exactly a big win. There could also very likely be a selection bias going on here. To even make it to the Tour, you have to have elite level genetics, and it could very well be the case that having these genes would protect these individuals from being plagued by many of the ailments that afflict the general population, regardless of whether or not they trained and competed or not. That being said, this study on former elite athletes found that former endurance athletes lived 5 to 6 years longer than their peers and even outlived their own brothers, suggesting that genetics alone can't explain it. What I would say is this: there appears to be a minimum effective dose of exercise, and that is generally higher than what is often recommended to normal people. We're talking about 3 to 6 hours a week depending on intensity levels. That is still a heck of a lot less than a lot of cyclists ride their bikes, and the best evidence that we have right now seems to suggest that there is a leveling off, meaning no worse or no greater mortality outcomes beyond the minimum effective dose. Going to the extremes with your training like pro cyclists or other professional endurance athletes do doesn't seem to be bad for you, but when you get to these levels of physical activity, the data gets a lot more fuzzy because so few people exercise that much. That being said, it is certainly better than doing nothing at all, and endurance athletes are better off than the general population. Now, you may have noticed that this video is not over, and that's because unfortunately pushing your body really hard for really long periods of time is not without its risks, and one of those risks is atrial fibrillation. This is where the upper chambers of the heart, or atria, beat irregularly, usually too fast, and this is where things can start to get a little scary. This study on arrhythmias in cross-country skiers looked at the number of completed races and finishing times for participants in a 90-kilometer cross-country ski event. Of the over 50,000 athletes that were examined, a little over 900 of them experienced arrhythmia, which is about 1.7%. Not a huge amount, but hold on. Digging deeper, they found that those who had completed the most events and those with the fastest finishing times had the highest risk of arrhythmias. And unfortunately, digging further into the literature only confirms this pattern. This review on the topic found that middle-aged athletes had a 3 to 10 times higher risk of AF than non-athletes. We can see here that the risk rate comes down slightly with a small amount of exercise over being completely sedentary, but then quickly goes up to the point that it actually gets worse than not exercising at all. And perhaps the scariest part is that the highest group is not even doing a lot of exercise compared to what many cyclists do. Again, we're talking about 5 to 10 hours per week, depending on how hard you're riding. Man, that last minute of the video really did look pretty doom and gloom, and if you're starting to get nervous, I don't blame you, but we do have some good news here, so bear with me. Remember that study on cross-country skiers? Well, they did a follow-up to that to see if these higher incidents of AF actually led to more strokes. What they found was that while athletes were more likely to develop AF, they actually had lower rates of stroke and death once they had it. This leads us to the conclusion that on net, exercise is beneficial and should not be avoided. And this isn't the only time where an adverse finding is found in athletes, but that doesn't necessarily lead to worse outcomes for those athletes. This study on coronary artery disease in masters athletes found that lifelong endurance athletes, especially men, had more coronary artery calcification on CT scans than sedentary guys. But, and this is key, their plaques were more calcified and stable, meaning they're less likely to rupture and cause a heart attack. This study found the same thing. Yes, more plaque, but more stable plaque, the kind that's less likely to kill you. This is good news, but before I move on, I want to put all of this into perspective because the last thing that I want is somebody to leave this video scared of exercising. If you watch this video and use it as an excuse to not do your training, then I haven't done my job. Wait. This is your job? Bro, you've put out like 3 videos all year. Get off your lazy ass and tell me what tires I need to buy already. So the important question, what are the actual chances of experiencing a life-altering or life-ending cardiac event while doing intense endurance exercise? This study on long-distance runners and cardiac arrest may help us answer that question because these cardiac events often happen when people are pushed to their limit during a race. They looked at the incidence of cardiac arrests in marathons and half marathons in the United States over a 10-year period. What they found was that of 10.9 million runners, 59 had cardiac arrests, which, in case you aren't doing the math, is roughly 0.0005%. So while it does happen, the risk is still relatively low. That being said, it is never a bad idea to get your cardiovascular health checked as an endurance athlete to determine whether or not you are at high risk. Now I want to transition and talk about the growing trend of stuffing as many processed carbs down your throat as your poor gut can handle. If there's anything that a kid's birthday party and an endurance event have in common, it's a whole lot upset stomachs and maybe even some puking after eating way too much sugar. In case you've been living under a rock and have no idea what I'm talking about, it has become common practice in the last 5 years in endurance sports to consume 90, 100, 120, 150 grams of carbohydrates per hour while racing and training. Shoot, Cam Jones, who won Unbound this year, did just shy of 200 grams per hour, which if you do the math is nearly 7,000 calories of basically processed sugar that he consumed over the course of the race. That one is obviously a pretty extreme example, but riders are now encouraged to do this after every training ride to train their gut to handle it and improve their performance and recovery after the workouts. If you were to ride 15 hours a week consuming 90 grams of carbs per hour while you ride, that's an extra 5,000 calories worth of processed sugar a week. And to be clear, this type of fueling strategy is research-backed. Many studies have been coming out recently on the performance and recovery improvement you get from maximizing carb intake. But then the question becomes, is this short-term performance gain coming at the cost of your long-term health? I mean, surely consuming that much sugar cannot be good for you. I think most people probably already know this at this point, but consuming a lot of sugar is associated with bad health outcomes, including metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and all-cause mortality, and that really only scratches the surface. That being said, these studies are not generally done on athletes, and they're not generally done with the caveat that this sugar is consumed while exercising, which is a very important distinction. Now, there is a logical reason to believe that sugar consumed while you're doing endurance exercise is not as harmful as sugar consumed while you're sitting on the couch. After all, a lot of the harm of sugar comes from the blood glucose spike that you get with it and the subsequent insulin release. Down the line, this can lead to insulin resistance, weight gain, increased inflammation, liver damage, and so on. When you exercise, though, your body is massively increasing glucose uptake because that glucose is being put to work immediately and less insulin is released. It's then theorized that consuming sugar while exercising is not nearly as damaging for your health. The key word there is theorized. We actually don't have any studies at this point to conclude whether or not that's true. It could very well be the case that exercise completely blunts the negative effects of sugar, but we just don't know. There is a message that I would like to drive home with this section of the video, though. What we do know is that consuming large amounts of sugar when you are not exercising is not good for you. So just because you're smashing in the sugar on the bike does not mean that you should be doing that off the bike. Wow. I swear, this dork's next video is going to be about how you shouldn't drink beer because he read some study that it makes you recover 4.7% slower than drinking non-alcoholic spritzers or something. This doesn't mean you need to limit carb intake off the bike. Believe me, if you have watched any of my videos on this topic, you know that I am not a low-carb guy. But the carbs you do consume off the bike should come in the form of whole foods. We're talking brown rice, oats, fruits, vegetables, etc. These foods have fiber and other nutrients that blunt the blood glucose spike. There is no need to be consuming high amounts of processed carbs to fuel your ride when you're not actually riding. Because unfortunately, if you do that, you probably are compromising your long-term health. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe, and share it with your cycling friends. I'll see you in the next one.